Welcome to our channel. Today, we're going to summarize The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. The Catcher in the Rye is a novel by J.D. Salinger, published in 1951. It tells the story of Holden Caulfield, a troubled teenager who has just been expelled from his boarding school and is wandering the streets of New York City. The novel is narrated by Holden himself, and the chapters are structured as a series of episodic encounters and experiences. Chapter 1, Holden Caulfield, a teenage boy, introduces himself and begins telling his story. He has just been expelled from his school, Pensy Prep, and is leaving to spend a few days in New York City before going home to his parents. Chapter 2, Holden arrives in New York City and checks into a hotel. He spends the evening wandering around the city and reflecting on his life. Chapter 3, Holden meets a former classmate, Ackley, who is living in a dorm at a nearby college. Holden is annoyed by Ackley's company and soon goes to bed. Chapter 4, Holden goes to a nightclub but feels out of place and uncomfortable. He then hires a prostitute but ends up feeling too guilty and depressed to follow through with the encounter. Chapter 5, Holden meets up with a girl he used to know, Sally Hayes. He tries to convince her to run away with him, but she refuses. Holden becomes upset and they part ways. Chapter 6, Holden has a date with an old friend of his, Jane Gallagher. He becomes very anxious about the date and is unable to enjoy himself. Chapter 7, Holden has a difficult time sleeping and spends the night walking around the city. He eventually ends up at his sister Phoebe's school. Chapter 8, Holden spends the day with his little sister, Phoebe. They go to a museum and then have lunch together. Holden confides in her about his feelings of alienation and despair. Chapter 9, Holden meets up with a former English teacher, Mr. Antolini, who offers him advice and encouragement. Holden stays the night at Mr. Antolini's apartment, but becomes anxious when he wakes up to find Mr. Antolini stroking his head. Chapter 10, Holden becomes increasingly agitated and paranoid. He goes to a bar and gets into a fight with some strangers. He then decides to leave New York City and go out west. Chapter 11, Holden spends a few days in a cabin in the mountains, where he tries to clear his mind and make sense of his life. Chapter 12, Holden takes a train to California and spends a few days in San Francisco. He feels increasingly disconnected from the world around him and begins to have a breakdown. Chapter 13, Holden visits an old friend, Carl Luce, who tries to help him by offering advice and criticism. Holden becomes angry and leaves. Chapter 14, Holden spends a difficult night in a hotel, where he becomes increasingly disturbed and anxious. Chapter 15, Holden goes to visit his sister, Phoebe, at her school. They have a conversation about his plans for the future and Holden reveals his desire to be a catcher in the rye. Chapter 16, Holden spends the night at his former teacher, Mr. Antolini's apartment. He has a difficult time sleeping and becomes anxious when Mr. Antolini tries to offer him advice. Chapter 17, Holden leaves Mr. Antolini's apartment and spends the night walking around the city. He begins to feel more hopeful and reflective. Chapter 18, Holden goes to visit his little sister, Phoebe, and they spend the day together. Holden realizes that he needs to return home and face the consequences of his actions. Chapter 19, Holden sneaks into his family's apartment and has a conversation with his little sister, Phoebe. He then leaves and spends the night on a bench in Central Park. Chapter 20, Holden has a mental breakdown and is taken to a psychiatric hospital. He spends some time there and receives therapy and medication. Chapter 21, Holden reflects on his experiences and his time in the hospital. He begins to feel a sense of hope and healing. Chapter 22, Holden meets with his former teacher, Mr. Antolini, who tries to offer him guidance and support. Holden becomes anxious and paranoid and leaves. Chapter 23, Holden spends some time walking around the city, reflecting on his past experiences and trying to make sense of his life. Chapter 24, Holden goes to the museum he visited with his little sister, Phoebe, and reflects on the idea of change and preservation. Chapter 25, Holden has a final conversation with his little sister, Phoebe, where she gives him a note of encouragement. Holden decides to try to start fresh and make positive changes in his life. Chapter 26, Holden concludes his story and expresses his desire for things to remain the same and for children to be protected from the harsh realities of the world. Thanks for watching. To read the full version of the book, click on the link in the description below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for similar content.